All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is we're going to create an app, or actually a few apps, to kind of perform as a simple RSS reader. So I got a couple quick slides here. So we're going to read the Xojo Blog's RSS feed, which of course is at blog.xojo.com/feed. And we're going to make some simple apps, one for desktop, a web app, and then an iOS app that will display the contents of that feed, and then they'll let you click on a article title and then display the actual article from the website. And this is based on a blog post that Javier Rodriguez did, I don't know, a couple weeks ago maybe. I think he had originally done a video on it in Spanish perhaps. But I'm going to do my own take on it. My app's a little bit different than the one that Javier did in his blog post. I'll be using a subclass with events rather than the interface method that he used. So I'll hide this slide for the end, and we can just jump right into Xojo and other things. So first of all, I just want to show you what the feed itself looks like. So this here is the feed we're going to be hitting, and you can see it returns back a bunch of XML with the feed contents, and the primary things we're concerned with are the title of the article that's on the blog, and then the URL link. There's a lot of other stuff in here, but we're going to ignore that for this simple little app. But you certainly could parse out more stuff that's in here if you wanted to add a lot more features to the app. And I just use the tool here called PAW, P-A-W, that I think I've used in other webinars. It's a great tool for testing web service requests and things that return back data, so you don't actually have to write an app and connect to it and then maybe look at the results in a debugger or something like that. This is pretty nice. And it has the ability to add, as you can see right here, some kind of, I don't know if they call them plugins or scripts or whatnot, but it can help auto-generate some code that you can drop right into Xojo. So anyway, that's kind of what the data that we're going to play with looks like. And I think I need to switch to my other screen to get a new project created. There. All right, so we're going to create project here. We'll call it Desktop Reader. And this will be a pretty simple project, of course. Can't get into too much details in a webinar, but for the layout, it's just going to have a couple things. We're going to put a list box on one side that'll have the article titles from the blog, and I will just call this, let's see here, we'll call this article list. And then I'm going to add an HTML viewer to the other side to display the actual page of the article. And I'll just lock these so that they stretch. All right, so very, very simple layout there. So to start with, we're going to want to actually connect to that RSS feed, get the XML data, and kind of parse it out so we can display it in this UI. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a class here. And I'm going to call the class RSS Reader. And I want to make it a subclass of the new framework's HTTP socket. And then now that it's a subclass, I can add an event handler to it, and the one I want to use is page received, because this is the event that gets called when the data is received from the URL that we send it. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this, the data that comes in is going to come in as content, and I'm going to essentially convert back down so that it can be processed as XML, and then we're just going to iterate through it and pull out the title and the links that are in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those to a class that just contains those two properties, so I can pass it around a little more easily. And so a little bit of prep work, I'm going to create that class. Oops. So I'm going to have a very simple class called article, and I'm just going to have on it two properties. And that's going to be used by this RSS reader class. So I'm also going to add an array of them here. So now I can use it in my page received event. So now I'm going to cheat. And as I hide things, I will copy and paste some parts of code so that I can, hang on, more easily get it over there rather than me attempting to type badly. All right, let's make that a little bigger so we can see all the code at once. So here, we'll just go through this. First thing we're going to do is check the HTTP status code to make sure it's 200. That makes sure we actually sent in the right URL and it said yes, everything was okay, some data came back. Then I'm going to make sure that I clear my articles array that I have as a property, just in case we call this multiple times. You don't want to get everything duplicated. And then these next two lines are going to take the content that comes in as a memory block and then it's going to convert it to text. So you can see I'm calling the, essentially way down at the end, you can see I'm calling the convert data to text method, which is part of the text encoding class. And the UTF-8 gives me the particular instance. So essentially I'm saying on the text encoding class, use the default shared UTF-8 instance and use that to convert the data, the binary data that came back into actual text that we can then work with. So once that's converted to text, I can use that to populate an XML document. And then this next bit of code is, some of that is taken right from Javier's blog post. And essentially we're just using XQL or I guess XQuery or something, sometimes it's called. And it's just searching for all the nodes in the XML that contain item. And once it has that, it's just going to loop through them and then grab out of each of those the title and the link portions. And it's going to save those in their own little variables here. And then we create a new article, assign them to the article, and then append it to the array. So that's all the loop's doing, just chugging through the XML, yanking out the title and the URL, adding it to our class, which is then appended to the array. And then the last thing it does is calls this thing right here, feed results, passing in the array of articles. Now, what is feed results? Well, that's actually an event. We haven't created it yet, but it's an event handler that we're going to add. So our own event handler that we're going to add to this subclass. So you can just add it under event definition. And it takes the articles we pass in as the parameters. Now you can't put any code in here. This is the code that you'll see this event show up when we use this class and we create an instance of it on our window. And that's pretty much it. Go back to page received. You can see this is probably the bulk of the code we're going to have here. The rest of the code is just going to display things. But that's what the RSS reader's responsibility is it's going to essentially pull down the data that's received. Now, one thing I am forgetting is we actually have to tell this thing to actually go get data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another method here, and I'm going to call it fetch. And this method is going to just call the URL. So we can just say this will send the actual request out, and then when the data comes back, it'll call the page received event. So this will allow us to more easily use it on the window. So if we go back to the window, to use our RSS reader on the window, we can just drag it over to it. And you see you do that, it adds it down here on what's called the shelf, because this is a non-visual thing that is on the window. We can give it a better name than that. And if we go to the event handler, we can see that our event that we added, feed results, now shows up here. And I can choose to add that one. And it now shows up there. And I think here I'm probably going to cut and paste a little bit more code. So I just pasted in very simple code here. We're just going to delete any rows from the list box that we added, and then we're going to iterate through the articles that are passed in here, and then just add them to the list box. We use the title for what's displayed, and the row tag will be the URL. And that's what will check when one of the rows is clicked so that we can display the URL in the HTML viewer, which means we need to add an event handler to the list box. And that's going to want to be the change event handler right there at the top. And again, I'm cheating by copying and pasting. Not that this is a lot of code, but since I can't actually see my keyboard with my big microphone in front of me, I'm bound to make lots of typos. So here, we're just making sure that a row is selected. And we get the URL for that row, and then we tell the article viewer, the HTML viewer, to actually load it. Edwin is noting that I left the scope of fetch as private, and that's going to cause a compiler error when I get to the next step. So I'm switching it right back to public now. And that's okay. That brings up a good point, is I often will set things to private, almost by default, so that I don't end up with stuff that's, randomly set to public. Because if you forget and leave something to private, that's not so bad. If you try to run, you'll get a compile error that says it can't find your method because it's private. Well, then you can go and say, oh, well, I need that one to be public. You can go fix that really easily. And you don't end up with methods or properties or anything that are exposed that you really didn't want to be exposed. It kind of forces you to only expose the minimum things that need to be exposed. But yes, I do need fetch to be public, and I need that to be public so that I can call it. And essentially what I want to do is when the window first appears, so I use the open event handler here, I want to call with the URL that we want to use, which was, actually I think I remember that. I think it was something like that. Before we get too far, I want to save this. And we'll save it in our little folder here. And let me just verify that I did remember that URL. Yep, that looks right. All right, I think I didn't forget anything. So let's just run this and see what happens. Oh, lots of mistakes. More of these protected things. Edwin only told me about one, but I have others. So here it's telling me that I have some other things that are protected or private. And of course, the class I made that I added the two properties that you need to be able to assign, I left as private, so you can't assign them. So that's bad. We'll switch those back to public. So all of those errors were corrected just by fixing that little scope problem. So here we can see the app started up. I've got a list of all the articles showing in the list box, and if I click one of them, the page loads in the HTML viewer, which you can then scroll through and read. And that all works as we want it, so that's cool. So as you can see, pretty simple, but the concept here of creating a subclass and then adding your own event definitions so that you can easily access them when you use the subclass on the window is very common and something you probably use in a lot of your apps. So certainly take advantage of that. I find it's a little simpler than the technique that Javier used in his post, but it all depends on your background, where you're coming from. So it's a nice little contrast. As I like to tell people, it's always great to have multiple ways to solve a particular problem. You never know which one might work better for you. And let's see here. So the next thing we want to do is let's create a web version of this. And web version is going to use a lot of the code we already have here. So we'll start by grabbing the things we want to reuse. So first I want to reuse the article class. So I'm just going to copy that and come over here and paste it. And also the RSS reader class. I can just copy and paste that as well. Presuming I pressed paste or copy. I'm going to look so I can see which keys I'm actually pressing here. There. So I now have these two classes as is, no changes here. So I can go to the web page and I can do my layout and same sort of layout. Just going to have a list box. And an HTML viewer. And we'll give this a title. And we'll save that. One thing you may notice is one thing I have embedded in my brain is the Command S key shortcut. I often save as I'm working, almost like it's part of what I'm typing. I got that from when I used to use Microsoft Word a lot, and it crashed. It was like you get to an end of a sentence, you type period, and then it was Control S on Windows at the time. So period Control S was how I ended my sentences, so that I always had a save. And I still kind of do that a lot with all the apps I use. So same sort of setup here. We've now got this set up here. I can drag the RSS reader onto the web page, just as I did before. Add the event handler, same as before. It'll actually use the same code, I think. Actually, I'm not sure if that's the same method. It is. iOS has a different name. And then on the web page, I'm going to add the, I'm going to use the shown event handler to actually populate that. So call the fetch command. And then on the article list, I want to add the event handler for when the selection has been changed. And that's going to correspond to the code that's here in the change event. Alrighty, just eyeballing my other version to make sure that I think I caught everything I needed to have here. What the heck, I'll just run it and see what I did or didn't remember to do. Yes, that. I think I have to do URL equals like that. Apparently I didn't lock that quite right. But, you can see the overall app works the same. Not a lot of differences that had to be done. It was just primarily in the UI stuff, as you might expect. The actual two classes that are used work exactly the same. No changes needed there. So that is good. Let's go back to Xojo here. All right, before I move on to iOS 1, we've got a couple questions here I want to just take a look at. All right, Edwin's asking about external classes and sharing code. And he's noting that, does it make sense to, rather than copy and paste like I did, to save the class as external so that you can use it in both places at once? And that can certainly make a lot of sense. It really depends on your development philosophy and how you're working. Copying and pasting code in this manner has the downside of, if it turns out I found a bug, say in my RSS reader implementation, and I made a change to, say, the page received event, well, obviously that change is not going to be reflected back in the desktop project because I just have a copy of it here in the web reader project. So that's a bit of a risk. You have essentially, completely separate copies of code. But that could also be a good thing if, you don't want a change here to maybe break another project. Because, if I did have this as an external item and the desktop and the web were both sharing the same, essentially the same class on disk, if I made a change in the web project and then I opened the desktop project, it would pick up the new file and have the change that I made. But that would mean that I have to remember to test now the desktop project, because I essentially have made a change to that project by changing the external file. So you got an extra dependency there that may or may not be what you want. And there's good reasons to do it that way, and there's concerns to do it that way, depending on how your projects are structured. So just something to keep in mind. Know the pluses and minuses of doing it either way. Personally, when I had larger projects, I often would keep the shared code in its own project, essentially, in version control. And then I would take specific versions for use in projects so that I didn't run the risk of having dependency problems. Because if you've got a bunch of projects working at the same time, it can be hard to go and test them all to make sure that one change you need for one project doesn't break 5 other projects. That would obviously be really bad. So again, evaluate what makes sense for your project, but either way can work. And Edwin is also noting that we could use compiler constants to share even more code, perhaps. Probably not the code that is actually in the UI controls, because that's, the UI controls aren't really shared. But code like this, if you actually had it in an actual class, this could be separated with a #if target web. Do it this way. Else it could do it the other way. You'd call in the load URL method. So there are ways that if you do like to share your code in that manner, you can use those compiler constants to make it a little easier for you. All right, so the iOS project, that's a little bit trickier. As if you've worked with iOS at all, or you started to scan the docs or anything, one thing you're going to notice, or one thing you will have noted, is that iOS requires the use of the new framework. And that's why I'm using here the xojo.net.http socket. But the new framework does not have any classes or methods or anything for handling XML. It has JSON, but no XML. So that means we can't really easily parse out this RSS feed. So much sadness. I mean, it is obviously just text. XML is just giant text. So we could do some sort of, string handling to kind of, search through the text to find what we're looking for. But I don't want to do that. That's not fun. So what I'm going to do is something a little more fun. What I'm going to do is have the web app essentially take the XML data that we've already put into the array, and I'm going to set that web app up so that it essentially repackages that up as JSON. And then our iOS app is going to talk to the web app and get the data as JSON, and then display that instead of the raw XML from the feed. So let's start an iOS project here. Always click it first. So initial layout is going to be 2 views. Since we'll just keep this at the phone level, I'm not going to get into doing a split view with an iPad at this point. Don't mind me while I try to get my master copy on the other screen so I can make sure I set this stuff up the way I want, with the right names and stuff. So here we got our table, just called article table. And you can see I'm dragging it with the alignments. I've got it set the way I want, I think. But these things all look fine as far as the positioning. So that should be good. I can grab my article class right from here, paste that in, and I can also grab the RSS reader class, so we'll have to tweak this a little bit, and we'll put this in here. Now let me save this, but before we get too far along the iOS one, we do have to make a change to the web project, of course, so that it actually does this conversion of sorts. So the first thing I want to do here is I'm going to add a property to the app class. Which is going to contain the array of articles, and that is public, so that's good. And then on our page received event here, I can just assign it to the app property. So this means we'll have to have obviously launched the web app, and the page will have to have come up at least once in order for this to be populated. And then back on the app, I can add an event handler, and we'll just use handle URL. And I'm going to have to copy and paste this, so let me find that window. All right, so a little bit more code here. So what I'm doing here is I'm making sure that there's actually articles in the array, and then I'm making sure that the path of RSS was specified. And if both those things are true, then we can go through and essentially package this up at JSON so we can send it back. So first I'm going to create a dictionary and just fill it with the stuff from the articles. Now luckily our articles class in this particular case is pretty simple. It just has the title and the URL. So I can just use the title as the key and the URL as the value. If this class had more stuff in it, which it certainly could, we could have, post date and other things, then this would be a little trickier to push in, because we'd probably need dictionaries pointing to dictionaries to be able to contain all the properties. But the general concept is the same. Once the dictionary is all populated with our information, you can convert it to JSON with a simple call to the generate JSON method. And this gives us back JSON text. And then now we can tell handle URL to return it back. So we set the status to 200, say all's okay, and you call the print method on the text and return true, and that sends it back. So that part's pretty easy. I also have an else here in case our criteria did not pass. I set the status to 204, which is a no content status, and I return false. And this generally, we won't have a test case for this at the moment, but this would be if the web page was unable to access the Xojo RSS feed for some reason. All right, so oops, is in place here. Let's save this. Now I'm going to run the web project, and we can see it still comes up. But I'm going to take this URL, I'm going to go back to PA. And you remember we want to have RSS on here. So here is where I can do a quick test to make sure that I'm getting back JSON data. So I can test this before I continue on my iOS app to make sure that this part of the web app's working the way I expect. And a quick glance seems to be that it looks okay. This looks like JSON data. I've got, you know, the curly bracket and the key and the value and commas and separating all that. So that looks okay. So it looks like our web app is working fine. So we'll just leave that running and we'll go back to the iOS app, which is that one. All right, so on iOS app, we've got our RSS reader set up here. And by and large, that is okay, but obviously the code here isn't too useful anymore. First of all, it's referring to XML document. That's not going to fly on iOS. And it's actually receiving JSON now anyway, so we need to change that. And as you might guess, I'm going to copy and paste these changes in. So the structure is the same. Still clearing the articles, taking the incoming data and converting it to text. And since that text is JSON, it can be converted back to a dictionary because we know that's where it came from. And we use the parse JSON method to do that. And then once it's in dictionary, we can just iterate through the dictionary, grab the keys and the values, and do the same as before. Create a new article and append it to the array, and then call the feed results method with the array of articles. All right, so I think that changes that part here. So we can go back to the UI portion. And we want to add our event handler. We want to add our open event handler. And this again is going to call, oops, well, before we do that, I got to add the reader to the class here. So let's do that. And we call that Xojo Blog reader. And all right, so I'm losing my place here. So I have that on there. So now I can add its event handler, feed results. And then I also wanted to add the open event handler. So, and here, same sort of thing, except we have a different URL now. We're not going directly to the Xojo Blog feed because that returns XML and we don't want that. So we're going to the local host that I have running here, and we're using that URL. So that's what I have to enter here. And it's time to copy and paste some more code. So I'm grabbing the feed results code. And we're coming right here. All right, so here the feed results code is populating the table with the data. So first it removes anything that's in there, adds an empty section, iterates through the articles, creates a cell, sets the main text to be the title of the article, sets the tag to be the URL, just like we did with the list box, and then adds the cell to the row. So that populates it. And we can try running this, see how we are before we get to the actually displaying the article. So hooray, the page comes up, it populated it. Clicking doesn't do anything yet because we didn't add that bit of code, so that would be the next thing to add. And what we're going to want to do is when you click on a title, we're going to push a new view onto the screen that displays the actual article. So we'll add another view here. All right, got my keys off of the home row there. All right, so we've got our article view. I'm going to add to it here an HTML viewer. That'll just take up most of the screen. Before that, though, I'm going to turn on the navigate bar so that the back button shows up. So this is going to show the article just like we used it on the web and the desktop. But I'm going to add a method on here. And I want to make sure I use the same name, so I'm just checking that. And we'll call that and I'm just going to have a method here to populate it, so it's going to be and that is public, so that'll work. And then back on the table, so the table where I am showing the view, so right here, back on view 1, its table, I'm going to add the action event handler and put in these lines of code here. And I'm going to get the data. Oops, I hate it when I have typos like that. I'm going to grab the data from the currently selected row, and then we put the URL in the tag. So I'm going to grab that from the tag, and then I'm going to create a new article view. I'm going to call the method on it, and then I'm going to display it. And that's it. And you can see the page comes up. Now this page that comes up is coincidentally a good page. So we're going to briefly talk about this next. You'll notice that all my HTTP URLs are working just fine here when I'm running in the simulator. And that's great, but if you look more closely, you'll see it's because I have right here, I'm running iOS 8.4. Well, iOS 9 has a new thing that's enabled that happens to be called App Transport Security. And essentially, it means that apps that are running on iOS 9 cannot call HTTP URLs. They have to be HTTPS. They have to be secure. So if you try to use an HTTP URL when you're running iOS 9, you'll either get back an error or nothing. So let's switch over here. We'll switch to an iPhone 4 running iOS 9, and we'll run this. And wait a moment for that one to boot because I haven't launched it yet on this account. And nothing. I got nothing. No error here. We didn't implement the error event handler of the HTTP socket subclass. But essentially it would complain about something related to app transport security. So boo hiss, how do we get that to work? Because I obviously don't have HTTPS running right now at the moment on my local host, and I don't think I'd want to go through the trouble of setting that up. But it turns out you can kind of circumvent that pretty easily using a plist. So you can create an info plist, and what I want to do here is figure out a good way to open the one I have. So let me we'll open that with Text Wrangler maybe. So I have a simple plist that I've created, and this has added two things to it. I've added here, you can see localhost, and I've also added the Xojo Blog. Now you have to put in domain names here, so I couldn't for localhost put 127.0.0.1. That won't work. It actually has to be a name, so you have to use localhost. And that means in your URLs, you also have to use localhost. You can't use the 127 blah blah or just any IP. And then here I've put the Xojo Blog domain in because that's the URL we hit to actually pull in the content in the HTML viewer. So I put both of these specific entries in here. If you read the blog post that I clicked on earlier, there's a bit more specifics on other things you can do in this plist. And this is also covered in the docs for the HTTP socket and HTML viewer. Right now, this is only a problem with iOS apps, or only a concern, really. It's not really a problem, but only something you need to be concerned about with iOS apps. Although Apple has implemented the same thing in the latest versions of OS X, Xojo's HTML viewer and classic HTTP socket use their own protocols, so aren't impacted by this. If you do use the new framework HTTP socket, however, it could possibly be impacted by this. So you want to test on your particular setup and see if you need one of these keys. So anyway, to use this plist, you just have to drag it into your project. So we go back to our iOS Reader project and Finder, and I can just drag the plist into the navigator and it'll show up there. And now I can run. And you can see still running iOS 9.3, but now all the data came in, and I can click on a particular post and its data also, or the page actually comes in. So that's the tweak you have to make if you're running into this situation. And of course, for testing purposes, perhaps the easiest thing is to just run on iOS 8.4. But of course, you'll probably want to test your plist using a newer version to make sure you've set it up properly and all that good stuff. But you can test on device to do that as well. If you want to add these older OSs to show up here, you have to do that using Xcode, which the blog post discussed the steps to do it, but you essentially just have to go to Xcode's preferences and tell it to install these other simulator devices if they're not already installed. They may already be set up for you. All right, that's the 3 projects I wanted to show today. I'm going to bring up the slide and take a look at any questions, and we'll jump back into Xojo to address those. So where is it? All right, so questions. Let me scroll here. All right, Edwin seems to have all the questions. He's always the question winner. All right, let's see. Why not use the articles array in the web app to populate the list box and populate the app.articles in the app open event? Yeah, you could absolutely do it that way. I was kind of segregating things for clarity more than anything else. Kind of reducing dependencies maybe a little bit as well, so that I'm just kind of passing around one thing rather than accessing code in a variety of places. But you don't have to go that route. You could certainly reuse stuff differently if you wanted. Edwin is noting, isn't the dictionary order not determined? And yes, that if you were paying close attention, you would have noticed that the iOS app did not display the articles in the same order that the desktop and web app displayed them. And that is because the dictionary is, the order is not guaranteed. So even though I kind of put them in the dictionary in the order they were in the array, they didn't come out of the dictionary in that same order. And that's a little bit annoying. But again, that's not really the purpose of a dictionary. It's not intended to maintain that level of ordering. I mean, if I were digging into this a bit more, I probably would be adding the publish date to the data I'm sending along. And then when I extract all that out, I would use the publish date to sort the array so that things are displayed in the order I want, rather than relying on a specific order. And let's see, there appears to be a little tip here from Edwin. A nice workaround for not using the IP address is putting a subdomain on an existing domain name, and then a few other networking setups, which he admits is a slight hassle, but you only have to do it once. I don't personally know how I would go about doing that. I'm not a super duper networking guru kind of guy, but that does sound slightly helpful. Although you do need a static IP address on your computers. I don't have that configured at the moment. I'm going to encourage Edwin to write that up as a blog post, and because that sounds like that might be useful in general. But so a tip there, if it turns out you want to rely on a better name rather than localhost, and which works fine when you're on the same computer, of course, but if you had multiple computers trying to talk to each other, then it would get a lot trickier if you didn't have an actual domain name set up. So that tip could prove very useful. All right. So I think that's all the questions I have from Edwin anyway. And I hope this little exercise in creating a simple app on desktop, web, and iOS was helpful. The recording of this and the sample apps will be posted within a day or two, so you can grab them and download them if you want to play around with them some more. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.